Let's continue our conversation looking at sexuality in the Middle Ages. So we covered about the ancient world. Now we're going to focus more on the medieval world. And there are some things that make it very different. As earlier I talked about asceticism. That really begins to shape the medieval mindset as to what is the purpose of sex in this world. So there's a great book by a historian named John Boswell called Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, and you read a section on that. And he's an early historian that looks at sexuality, particularly homosexuality, in a very intellectual way, very academic way. I think he's at Princeton when he wrote this piece. But anyways, he examines the way the medieval world looked at homosexuality. And as you read, you hopefully saw all the footnotes he had in his in the PDF that I posted, because he very much so looks at sexuality not from a 20th century perspective, but goes back to the original sources and looks at it from a lens from somebody who would have been alive back then and how they would have interpreted the material during in the context of that age. And that is important because a lot of time we look at sexuality through our lens and we kind of shape it to kind of fit our narratives. And that could be very problematic when we're talking about academic research. So one thing that he finds is that from today's perspective, when we look at gay communities, they tend to be mostly in urban centers, right? In cities, downtowns, right? In kind of major metropolitan locations. But what he finds is quite the opposite, that when it comes to sexuality, it tended to be more in the rural areas. And as you read, a lot of this stuff is happening within the church, right? Out in the monasteries, and the reading talks, it gives many examples about how many of the monks were engaging with other monks. And, for the most part, they got a slap in the wrist. So, it is important to note that it's quite the opposite of what we think of these communities today. And again, it wasn't much of a community, it's just a bunch of monks living together. Another kind of thing that he kind of challenges is this notion of the ideal relationship. As we saw earlier in the ancient world, the ideal relationship was man, right? A male body. In the medieval world, you would think, well, now it's going to be men and women. It's quite the opposite. The ideal relationship, right? The perfect relationship is between man and God. If you ever study church history, right, the idea is that you're married to God. The church saw sexuality as almost of a last resort. You're weak, you're giving into your desires. So if you're going to do it with a woman, but we'd rather you never do it and, just be one with God. So it kind of challenges that notion that, that kind of argument that man and women is the ideal relationship, at least in the Middle Ages, right? So in the medieval world, it's quite the opposite, right? It's man and God, which is something that the church is stressing as much as they could, even though they're obviously not very successful at it. And he noted how much of this activity between men is happening within the church, right? So it gives you many examples of how the church tries to address it, trying to have an abbot sleep, in the middle of the room to try to stop these men from, jumping into each other's beds. And even then, they're still doing it. They're trying to pass all these kind of rules to limit it, yet it continues, time again. So we find when it comes to sexuality, the church had to more or less kind of tolerate it. They weren't happy about it. Again, the ideal relationship is not to have sex at all. But if they can't stop it, well, maybe we can somewhat control it, right? Is it a sin? Again, I'm not arguing that the church was for it. I'll never make that argument because there's no sources that indicate that. So yes, the church did see it as a sin. However, it is important to note that it is no bigger sin than any other action during this period. So things like hunting will get you a 3-year penance, and being with another man would get you a 1-year penance. So yes, the church is not happy about it, but they're not, so concerned with it that it's the most damning thing in the world, right? So as a whole, right, I'm sure there's different priests and abbots that weren't happy about it, but as a whole, yes, it's a sin, but it's not a major sin. Again, hunting, it's much worse, right? And today, I don't think we would argue that, right? At least the way some people see these things. It's kind of interesting. So what is a sin then, right? How did the church view sexuality in the Middle Ages? Well, a lot of it had to do with how they view the purpose of sex. So earlier I noted that, the church obviously kind of justifies everything using religious texts. And we find that when it comes to religious documents, they're very complicated because a lot of times they're written in many languages. So if you ever read the Bible, you probably know that it wasn't written in English, and it certainly wasn't written in Latin. As we mentioned in the previous lecture, that you have all these kind of collection of books, particularly in the New Testament, right? You have all these collection of books written by different people, and the church kind of synthesized everything and put it all together. Well, all these things are written in different languages, right? Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and so forth. And again, language shapes culture, and culture shapes language. So it's very complicated to try to make a literal translation of any document. So, like I noted earlier, but other historians have noted this, that the concept of homosexuality just doesn't exist prior to the late 19th century, right? The word itself is something new. So again, we're not saying the church is okay with homosexuality, because they're not. But it is important to note that it's nowhere in the Bible. That a lot of it's like a modern translation where they use words that might fit our language, and they implement it to, help us understand these ancient world perspectives. There's a story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You probably read about it. And that was a very complicated story. If you ever read Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, a lot of it has to do with, kind of not welcoming strangers. And that's the reason why God kind of destroyed these cities. Yes, I think it does argue that they were engaging in kind of sinful acts, but the biggest issue is not welcoming outsiders. So, but it's all based on the way things are interpreted. So when it comes to sex, a lot of it had to do with the way the medieval world looked at the purpose of sex and what kind of sexual activity were you engaging in. As you read with the prostitution piece, the church was very limited on what you can engage in. You couldn't be with Jewish people, you couldn't be with Muslim people, you couldn't have certain sexual acts. If you were engaging in this act, it needed to be in a missionary position, right? So when it comes to the word sodomy, which a lot of times we have correlated with homosexuality, eventually it becomes almost synonymous with it. The word sodomy is very complicated because maybe today it might mean homosexuality, but in the medieval period at least, it didn't. When it came to the word sodomy, it really referred to the type of sexual act that you are engaging in. And Hikmar of Rhymes, if you can remember Hikmar with the whole Lothar story, he kind of helps define this concept of sodomy, kind of defining it as a emission of semen not directed exclusively towards the procreation of a legitimate child within matrimony, right? So basically, any act outside of procreation is considered sodomy. So even if you were with a woman, you could be defined as a sodomite. So if you're engaging in obviously anal sex, but heterosexuals do that too, right? Oral sex, sex for pleasure, all these things fall under this kind of general umbrella term called sodomy. So that's what makes it so complicated, that the church is very specific, only within matrimony. So if you were with your girlfriend, even if you were trying to have a baby, it would have been considered sodomy. So the question of, were they anti-homosexuality or same-sex relationships? Yes, but they were also anti every other sexual act too, and that's what the piece on Peter Damien kind of explains, right? And I think there's another piece too that, I mean, the church just was against everything. So they wanted you to engage in sex, but only for the purpose of procreation. Be quick about it and do it in a missionary position with your wife. That's the only way the church was going to, give you the thumbs up to engage in this act. So it's the inserting, the passive-active spectrum that the church is kind of looking at. And when it came to women and women, lesbian, what we would define as lesbian relationships, I was just recently reading an article that kind of looks at it. It's very complicated for women and women because women are naturally supposed to be perceived as naturally passive, right? In this type of relationship between men and women. So being with another woman, the church didn't really see it as a sexual act because they're not really inserting anything, though they did talk about things like that, people inserting different objects into each other. They were they didn't really see it in the same way, or at least as damning, when two men engaged in this relationship. So there are sources out there that talk about women being with other women, but they just didn't see it in the same lens as they saw with men. Did they have a word that, like the word today, homosexuality, that would have defined this kind of group of people that engage in this particular act? Well, John Boswell noted that the closest word is ludus, and ludus means game, and that might have been the closest word to define this type of act. I'm not sure if the word ludus is connected to the word lewd, a lewd act, right? People can get arrested for engaging in lewd acts, right? So it might have that kind of connection. But he argues even this one's not very useful because it could have had many different meanings. So you read a piece on Peter Damien, so I won't bore you with that. But again, he's very anti, people engaging in this type of act, anti same-sex relationships, and again, I did want to show you that the church is not okay with this. Nevertheless, by them not being okay with it, it tells us that it is happening. One of the pieces talked about, all the different things you can do, and obviously people were having sex while their partner was on their period, because it talks about not doing those type of acts, right? That is considered dirty and so forth. So the church is not happy about anybody having sex, right? Now they try to create different rules to eliminate same-sex type of activity, but a lot of times, particularly in the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, 1140, they just couldn't control it. There's no way to regulate this. If people are doing it, you can't get arrested, right? So they had to kind of just eliminate any kind of proposals because it just wouldn't have helped the church. People were engaged in this, not only this act, I mean, priests were getting married. There's just no way to regulate any of these rules that the church is trying to institute, and during this period in the early to High Middle Ages. But we also find that there's a lot of kind of language that talks about these type of relationships. There's a whole piece. There's some sources that talk about some poetry that's left behind right from this period, and one poem is called Ganymede and Helen. Helen, it's talking about Helen of Troy, and Ganymede is Zeus's lover, and it's like a rap battle of the Middle Ages. If you ever seen the movie 8 Mile, and you see them battling each other, right? It's kind of like that, but in the Middle Ages. And these poems, at least these sources that are left to us, kind of talk about who is the better lover. Ganymede, who's a male, or Helen of Troy, who's a female. Well, in most of these poems, Ganymede always loses to Helen. Helen was the most beautiful woman in history or whatever. So he always loses. But really the key point here to take away is that just by the very mention that Ganymede could have been a great lover, tells us that there is a form of acceptance, at the very least a form of tolerance in the Middle Ages, because they're actually talking about a guy being a good lover, right? And there's many examples of this. This is not just one isolated example. There's other poetry. This guy named Baudry, he writes all these poems, poems to a young lover, to a young man. The poem's called Idol of Venus. Venus is typically associated with women, but he's writing these lines to a male person that he's trying to have a relationship with. And then by the later part of the High Middle Ages, we find that male prostitution actually comes back. And so something that the church might have tried to do away with, we find it's kind of impossible to do away with it. So they just kind of tolerate it. I think it's by the 1400s where you really begin to see male-male relationships being punished. And I'm going to talk about that next in a little while. So we'll stop it here. Again, you have a quick discussion question, and we'll finish this up.